Well, now we get to bring in a living legend
Am I
who,
still
of
living?
course, you are. Yes, you're still living and you're still absolutely a legend.
Well, I am
One
in
of
my
the
living room, so I
there,
guess that's
one
something.
of one of the first female heavy metal front persons. Nice shirt, by the way. Thank you. The incredible Betsy Bitch from the band Bitch. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, Brian. How are you doing? Great to see you,
Always good to see you. We just saw you
even if
recently.
it's virtually.
I know. That's the way it is these days, right? We
It
just saw each
is,
other at a
yeah.
Metal Massacre premiere not too long ago.
Yeah, that was great. I had a great time.
That was fun. I'll do a quick plug for that. To go to Thunderflix, Flix on. It's an app that you can get anywhere, and Metal Massacre documentaries there where you can see the lovely Betsy Bitch talk a lot about the early days of the LA metal scene as well as all the other bands that were on the record.
Yeah,
And
it's
of
a
course,
great vehicle with which to revisit the 80s.
yeah, it's fun. And of course, I wanted you to be on the podcast because you should be here. And of course, I was I knew who to ask about for your the person that you want to talk about because he's tattooed on your arm. We're of course talking about Alice Cooper.
Can we
Yes,
see him?
yes,
Is he
exactly.
visible?
That's
There's
amazing.
Alice. I got to flex to make him look better. Yes, Alice Cooper. I always say if there was never an Alice Cooper, there wouldn't have been a Betsy Bitch, and then where the hell would we be?
Right, exactly. That's
Especially
why,
if there were never an Alice Cooper.
and that's
More
why I
so
like.
than if there were never me.
Yeah, right. That's why I like to talk about Alice on this podcast because, even though it's 100 songs to define heavy metal, I think that Alice had so much to do in the early 70s with really, there wasn't a lot back going on back then. There's Zeppelin, Sabbath, and really Cooper were kind of the three heavier bands out there. And some of this stuff, even I'm 18, which we're talking about today, like the riffs and parts of that song are still pretty heavy for 1970.
It was that I think that was um, the nucleus behind releasing it is that Bob Ezrin heard that riff and he said this is definitely a song that's going to go somewhere. He started out thinking Alice was saying I'm edgy. And let's see, I took some notes here. Sorry,
Oh,
I
nice.
got
Oh,
a
that's
cheat
good.
sheet here. It was uh, it hold on. It was their first top 40 hit. It peaked at 21. It was backside was Is It My Body? And
Yep.
I think it started out a longer version and Ezrin kind of trimmed it down to be a more, commercially viable length.
That's true. If you watch any of the performances from back then, like those German TV performances, whatever, the song is much longer and had a whole bunch of other parts to it that obviously got edited out on the record. So where did
Right,
you
different
come in?
verses that you don't hear on the album.
Exactly. It's really fun to go down that rabbit hole. So where did you first hear Alice Cooper?
A boyfriend of my sister, when I think I was 13 and she was 14. And we lived in New Jersey. I was born in Atlantic City. I lived in Brigantine, which is just over the bridge from Atlantic City. But my father remained back east. So when Jane and I were teenagers, my sister Jane and I were teenagers, we used to go back and stay with him for the whole summer at my mother's, very motivated urging. Get out of here. We were out of school and she wanted to do her thing, so she sent us back east. Anyway, it was her summer boyfriend. His name was Harry Parker. Can't believe I remembered his name. And he had just bought Love It to Death, and we were over at his apartment. I remember it was a summer night. It was like hot and humid. And I just remember everything about it because I was just like bowled over by what I was hearing. And he put Love It to Death on the turntable, and it was just instant mesmerization on my part, if that's even a word.
Oh, that's
And
great because that
especially,
means you.
18 jumped out at me. But so many other good songs on that album.
Yeah, it's an amazing record, and you came in right, right as this record was happening, which is pretty amazing. I came in a few years later because I didn't hear about any of this stuff. So was that the first
Because you're
heavy?
younger than I am. Everybody
Did you?
is.
No, no. Did you hear any heavy music before this? Was it the first time you heard something kind of heavy?
It was, I was still sort of coming out of the, the pop Beatles and, Paul Revere and the Raiders and all the, the 60s bands that, I had the 45s of, but I always sort of, even those bands, I always sort of gravitated towards the, really hooky, kind of heavy, you know, you know, bordering on hard rock type, songs and arrangements. So that, when I heard Alice, I was still hearing the hooks and the melodic melodies and vocals, but there was just something, edgier about it, no pun intended. There was just something that kind of, drew me in a little bit more. And that was really, how I first started, really digging hard rock, and then, metal sort of came after that.
Yeah, and again, like I said, this song was so heavy for when it came out. I mean, the subject matter is obviously I'm 18. It's a very teenage angst song, very much a ballad, not a ballad-ish, but certainly a pop-heavy song. And I've said a huge radio hit, which is I know for the band was pretty unbelievable. But some of those underlying riffs, though, to me, I mean, those were the early signs, and a lot of stuff on this record. Those are the early signs of heavy metal.
Yeah, and sticking on the subject of that particular song, the subject matter was a lot, that the listener, the young listener could hold on to. I'm 18 and I don't know what I want. But but yeah, that was, I would classify Alice as, the first really early, hard rock, almost bordering on metal band, when there really weren't that many around, like you said, Zeppelin. I don't really consider them metal, but definitely hard rock, and Sabbath, so there were only a handful of them around. I think when Alice came around, he sort of, perpetuated that trend.
And then, a lot of people also think more when you talk about early 70s Alice Cooper, they think more about the stage show and all the crazy stuff he was doing. I mean, he was definitely probably the most hated man in the world for a while in the 70s, but that all kind of came after this record came out. And, when this record came out, I don't think nobody really knew who they were. And the first song most people heard, because it was played on the radio, was 18, obviously.
Right. No, people hated him before that. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stories about how they used to, drive people out of. They would, like, flee for the exits when they came on. Their music was so raw back there, and back then, and Alice was, you know, just doing anything just to get, anyone's attention. So it was probably oftentimes, really out there. And yeah, so they, but I'm sure they dug that too, because at least they were getting a reaction out of people.
Well, that was the famous story when they played. I think it was the Whiskey, or I forget where it was, but Frank Zappa went to go see them, and they emptied the room out in like 10 minutes. And Frank said, "Anybody that can have this sort of reaction, I want to work with." And then he signed them to his label, and they put out those first two very strange records. And then Bob Ezrin came in, and all of a sudden had the Midas touch, and they became this amazing band.
Right. The strange ones were Pretties for You and Easy Action. Are
Yes,
those the two to which you refer?
yes, you are
I think
correct.
so. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and
When
then
did you
Love It to
first?
Death, that really was yeah, I mean, I've got those 2 first albums, and they're I'm sorry, Alice, nothing but love for you, but they weren't very good. I didn't really hear anything, and I kinda listened to 'em, after I discovered Alice, and I'm like, he got so much better after that. The Love It to Death, like I said, I dig practically every single song on that album.
Yeah, it's an amazing, amazing record. We talked to Jay Rustin about the production end of things, and I've said this a lot, that if you look at Black Juju, especially if you take off that stupid organ that drives me crazy, but that's a metal song. That's like almost a Black Sabbath riff on that song.
Yeah,
It's
it's very
so good.
dark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and wait, Halo of Flies is not
Hey,
on Love It to Death, is
no,
it?
Halo.
Is it?
That's on Killer.
Right, okay. Um, yeah, and well, I was, kind of likening that to Halo of Flies because, it's very, there's a lot more instrumentation than there is vocals, and a lot of, different strange, odd parts, so they're both kind of similar. I don't know what that has
Yeah,
to do with anything.
yeah. That's probably the predecessor. When did you first see Alice Cooper live?
I can tell you right off the bat, I saw him at the Hollywood Palladium with my sister and our mutual best friend, Diane. It was probably, I want to say, like, Oh man. Maybe 74, something like, wait, was it that late? I can't remember the year, but it was the Love It to Death tour. So I guess it must have been earlier on than that.
Oh yeah, wow.
Um,
I was gonna say the
yeah,
Palladium
so
must have been
I
earlier.
saw him at the Palladium. That was my
And what
first
was your
Alice concert.
and what was your reaction to what you saw on stage?
Oh, I was just, fixated, and all the next day, we were like acting out all the parts, and we went and bought, these giant black balloons because he had like these black balloons he was bouncing around on stage, and we were just, we were obsessed, and after that it was just, all Alice all the time for me.
I don't blame you. When did you want to become a singer and be in a band?
Um, Probably, well, it was in the late 70s, like 77, 78, and I joined, just answered some ads, on the recycler when that's when you used to look for, musical connections. I ended up with a couple of, just garage rehearsal type bands. We had like some minor gigs at, American Legions and, and things like that. And that was about 77, 78, I want to say. And then I joined the Box Boys after that. That was really my first, recording, performing band and my actual, entrance into, professional singing, like on stage and in the studio and recording.
So seeing Alice, did that give you your first inclination? Like, hey, I think I can do that, or I want to be in a band too.
Seeing Alice, absolutely, gave me the desire to be, not only just a singer, but a performer, hence the Betsy Bitch persona, and I always was just so down with his description of, you go see a band live, you don't want to just see them, standing there on stage, you want something visual, if not, you can just go home and listen to their music on your turntable. So I kept that in mind. That was definitely, an inspiration. And his theatrics, his, songs being about something other than, I love you, honey cupcake, it just, kind of straying from that a little bit. And then as far as my other, inspirations, when I, was looking up on stage at people and saying, I can do that, you'll appreciate this. Freddie Moore from the New Cats, he was a huge inspiration for me. I just used to think he was just the best performer anyway ever, and he actually came down to one of our rehearsals and kind of coached me. And then I saw the Runaways at the Starwood around, the same time period, and Sherry Curry, was great, especially for her age, very confident and really, had a lot of charisma on stage, and she was a girl, obviously a woman. And that was another when I, epiphanal moment when I said, I can do that too, or I want to do that too, and I can do it just as well, if not better.
That's amazing. I didn't know about
There's a long
The Freddie
answer to
Moore
that
thing.
question.
No, that was good. That was good. For those of you who probably don't know, the Cats were a band that were in the late 70s, early 80s in Los Angeles. They're a new wave band that was really amazing. I was a massive fan of theirs as well. And the
Great
singer,
songs.
Freddie, yeah, great songs. I still don't, to this day, have no idea why they weren't huge because so many bands from that
Me
scene, like
neither. That's one of
Oingo and
the
Walla Voodoo.
enigmas of my life.
Well, and another reason why I ended up kind of, putting out that compilation record, I just didn't want to see that happen to other bands that were good. But Freddie's, I guess his claim to fame, more or less, is he was married to a woman at the time named Demi Moore, who you might have heard of out there in
That's where she got
podcasting
the
land.
more.
Exactly. So that's interesting. And I guess because you came in really early and became one of the very first female fronted like hard rock metal bands with Bitch, and also had the big show. Like you guys put on a show every time from the first time I ever saw you. It's like, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, which was amazing.
That's, I mean, well, it was, David and Robbie's idea, the original guitar player and drummer, respectively, to put together an all male band with a female singer and call it Bitch. And then, David wrote Live for the Whip, and, we started rolling with the, with the image after that. but after that was introduced, to me initially, I rolled with it, and it was all, Alice sitting on my shoulder, telling me, to do this is going to look good. That's going to look good, be as theatrical as possible. So that, when I did perform, back then with all the props and the whips and the slave that came out of the box and all that was, totally Alice inspired. And, I hope I wasn't ripping them off too much, but that's definitely, what I had in mind was entertaining and performing as well as singing.
Yeah, I mean, look, the two of my favorite bands growing up were Kiss and Alice Cooper. So I love theatrics. I love bands that do shows. I'm like you. I want to see something happening up on stage, not just guys sitting up there, looking at their tennis shoes playing. I want to see a show. And I was obviously first got into Bitch because I really liked the music, and then went to the show and went, oh my gosh, I had no idea that there's this big show going on here. And back then, what you guys were doing on so many levels was very similar to Cooper in the fact it was very edgy, especially on the live front.
Yeah, it was something that nobody else was doing, which I also, thought kind of, you know, put us in a little more, on top of the metal heap of bands back then, so it was setting us apart, and it was giving us an image, as well as music to present to the fans.
Yeah, and going back to I'm 18 for a little bit, did anything that Alice did vocally kind of creep into your style at all?
Oh, I loved his voice. It's used to just get me hot and bothered because it wasn't conventional as mine isn't. Alice and I are not the best singers in the world, but we're, I think, good interpreters of songs. And, I really enjoy, telling the story of the song when I sing. That's why I like to write my own lyrics, because I like it to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I like it to make sense, not just, words that rhyme and yeah here and ooh there. I'd like it to be, indicative of, a little, mini story, like a little book that you read from the beginning to the end. And then when you come to the end and it's over, so, uh, what was the question?
No, you got it perfectly. But I think you bring up a really good point, because really in hard rock and metal, there aren't a lot of like classically amazing singers, but what they do is they emote so well.
Right.
You wouldn't call
That's what I was
Axl
talking
Rose.
about.
Yeah, you wouldn't call Axl Rose a great singer, or even Brian Johnson or Bon Scott, but they emoted so well and it worked so well with the music. And even Alice, not a classically trained vocalist or anything, but he had that edge, and it was kind of like almost like early James Hetfield in his prime with that kind of
The
that
growl
edge
and the
that he had.
rasp and the
Yeah,
growling, he didn't have a whole lot of vibrato, not anything that's like classically a great voice, yet, he brought it. He was on key, that's good. He had good, good tone and good pitch, and sang, interpreted the song well.
and I just love that. Like I said, I think you bring up such a great point about how it's the emoting the lyrics and singing the song. So it's more about the passion involved in the vocal performance than it really is about the aesthetics of it.
My favorite bitch songs to sing are the ones that are fun to sing, that I have a good time singing, and can, ham it up on stage if we're doing it live. Those are really my favorites.
When this record came out and you first heard it, obviously, and it kind of probably had, like you said, kind of a life-changing pattern to it. How often would you listen? I mean, it wasn't that easy back then to listen to records. You had to get the turntable out and all that. So
Oh, mine
how
was already
often would
out.
how often would you listen to that record when you first heard it?
Oh, multiple times a day, sometimes over and over, like, consecutively, just, one side after the other and turn it over and do it again. It was just, I just, I loved all those songs. And I wrote some down in case I didn't remember it. Caught in a Dream is one of my absolute favorite songs. I have that on my Spotify liked song list. Black Juju that we talked about, the Ballad of Dwight Fry, which live was just the highlight of the show, with the straight jacket. I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. And Is It My Body, which was very, kind of commercial and poppy, but very sexy and, kind of moody and smoky. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
Dwight.
that whole album, Hallowed Be My Name, My Stars, they're just great. They're really prolific songwriters. for and you were I was going to say before, when you were talking about, the most hated, when they were first coming out and they were the most hated because everybody just couldn't stand listening to them. But then, after they became successful, and Alice had you know, this image, where he's like beheading babies on stage and hanging himself and going under the guillotine. And so then the parents, hated them, but the kids still loved him. So he went through different periods of hate, but it was all good.
Yeah, and he was really one of the first originals that first and original that was doing a lot of that stuff. Even before then, you had Elvis was hated just because of what he was doing, but Alice was the one that was really pushing the envelope with, like you said, doing all these crazy stuff on stage and hanging himself in the guillotine and
Yeah,
spearing babies with
he
his
was
sword.
definitely pushing the envelope. But
Yeah,
but he
it's
was
amazing.
doing it with a sense of humor. As opposed to the bands these days that do it and they just want to be dark and scary and but Alice, it was burlesque, and he always said that too. And I got it. I was never intimidated. I was never like, oh my God, he's got he's holding a baby doll by its leg, on stage. I was never offended by it. I always knew that it was in good fun and accompanied by, really kick-ass music. So there was nothing wrong with it as far as I was concerned.
Tongue firmly planted in his cheek. Absolutely. And he's
Yeah,
one of the
definitely.
nicest, yeah, and one of the nicest people on the planet. I've been able to meet all the guys in the original Alice Cooper band, except unfortunately for Glenn Buxton. That they're all so nice, so down to earth, like really cool. You look at them as how controversial they were in the 70s. They're just regular nice guys.
Yeah, they were a good group of guys, and they were all friends, when they first started out. But uh, I've met Alice a few times, and I actually have one picture with him, which actually was facilitated by you. Allowed you gained me entry into a dress rehearsal for the Operation Rock and
Oh yeah.
Roll tour. You set it up for me, and I remember it was at a sound stage in Hollywood, and I got all decked out in my leather and my rhinestone bra, and I was like holding his leather jacket while he was performing. He gave it to me to hold, and then we took a picture together. And that I've got multiple framed, photos around my house everywhere. So that was a huge, memorable moment for me meeting him. And then I got backstage a couple other times for his shows, and he said he's heard of Bitch and he knows who Betsy Bitch is, and it sounded good even if he's not telling the truth. It was nice to hear. So yeah, I was able to meet him a couple times, and he is a very nice guy, very down to earth and nice. And, everybody knows that about him now.
Yeah, he was
Family
great.
man.
We reissued all those records back in the early '90s with Hoarders, and I had met him before then, but just such an awesome guy. It's so cool, and I love the stories about And by the way, he does know who Bitch was, of course, and who you were.
Okay, I
He
hope
know he
so. He could look
no
me up.
he
I've got a few pages on the internet.
He's he's no, he pays attention to music. In fact, I remember it's the one time I saw him. We were talking about the Struts, and this was a band where nobody knew who they were at the time. There's up and
I
coming
remember
British
them.
rock band. He's like, man, I love this new band, the Struts. I go, I love them too. So he has his ears to the ground, even still to this day, more or less, which is great.
Yeah, and he's still rocking. I mean, he's still touring. His bands kick ass, and he looks great. He sounds great. He's still doing it at what, 70? I can't do the math. I think he was born in 46.
Something like that.
Um,
Yeah, too older than most people are doing anything. So he's
Older than me. So
amazing.
then I
Yeah,
must have a few good years left.
He's 77.
Oh,
77.
okay, if I would have, subtracted, 1946 from 2025, I would have gotten it, but
I didn't
math
even
wasn't
think
my strong suit.
I thought he was like mid 70s, like 74, 75, 77. That's really impressive. Wow, that's
That's
insane.
pretty close to 80.
Yeah, and he doesn't look or sound it. He's still, I mean, I saw him like a year ago and he still was amazing. His band, of course, are phenomenal too.
Yeah, well, and I don't think he wants any generations to go by without, with missing Alice Cooper, without getting a little, Alice Cooper experience. So I'm glad that he's keeping it going, as long as he can. And, he's doesn't look like he needs to stop anytime soon. I see
Let's
him
hope
every
not.
time he
Yeah,
comes around.
absolutely.
So, but I wrote down a couple, well, like actually one cool thing that you didn't know, maybe you didn't know about 18. Did you know that Johnny Rotten auditioned for the Sex Pistols with that song?
Yeah, it's in there. If you watch the biopic that was on, I think I can't remember what thing it was on, but they had that, they showed that scene. They redepicted that scene, which was pretty amazing.
Oh, okay. I can't tell you anything you don't already know, Brian.
Well, you never know.
Yeah,
There were
I
some,
didn't know that. I thought that was cool.
yeah.
And and it speaks to the fact that, so many musicians and artists were influenced by them, and a lot of them fess up to it. I doubt if there was never Alice Cooper. I think Kiss was really influenced, by the makeup, obviously, Marilyn Manson, very theatrical bands like Wasp, I think, even Motley Crue said they were a little I think everybody's a little influenced by Alice. You can't be a musician in this day and age and not have a little Alice, just to keep you going.
100%. I mean, I think he should get more credit than he does. Actually, I look at, and I love David Bowie. I've always been a big David Bowie fan, but people put Bowie on this incredible pedestal. And Alice, I always thought Alice was even more influential than Bowie was in a lot of ways. But he's still doing it. He's still a legend. He's still drawing great people. And like you said, there's a whole nother generation now of younger bands who are getting influenced by Alice Cooper, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think the thing with Bowie was that people were just, really impressed by how many, different transitions he went through as far as his image, and when he said, Ziggy Stardust, this is the last show I'll ever do, who knew that he was going to recreate himself like, 5, 6, 7 more times. So I think that was the draw with Bowie. But, I definitely rank those two up there. I was very influenced by Bowie when I was in my little groupie, teeny bopper, groupie days back in the early 70s. I used to hang out at Rodney's, and, Bowie was a big deal back then. So yeah, that was part of, my musical influences along with Alice.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm a massive Bowie fan as well. My only point that I say I wish Alice was kind of up there with the way Bowie's respected. And I love Bowie. I think he was amazing and duly important for, like you said, just how many different things he did, how many different types of genres, and how he reinvented himself so many times. Brilliant guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. So, well, I can't thank you enough for doing this. You were awesome, of
Thank you for
course.
having me.
Thanks for doing this, and we'll have to do maybe your other band that you love, Cheap Trick, down the road or something.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm surprised I mentioned so many other bands. I'm surprised I didn't mention them. Cheap Trick, Cheap Trick, Cheap Trick. See, I can't even say it fast. So, but anyway, there's 3 of them. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I do need to say that Robin Zander was my vocal inspiration. One and only. Okay, now I have closure.
Okay, you're good. All right, thanks again for doing this. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody that's listening and has listened. And it was a pleasure to be Betsy Bitch at your service. You don't have to ask me twice to talk.
You got to hang out for a minute though, because we got to upload the audio. So
Okay.
we